increase in anti-Muslim hatred after the beginning of the War on Terror in 2001. That government policies were increasingly punishing Muslims in the UK. The idea of conspiracy theory is an idea which is used by Zionists in order to delegitimize and to block criticism of the activities of the Zionists themselves. Whenever there is a criticism of Zionism, what they do is they reach for, first of all, the conspiracy theory label, or they reach for the label of anti-Semitism, which they regard as being a form of racism against the Jews. Now that, of course, is at the heart of Zionist strategy and the heart of the foreign policy strategies of the Zionist entity. Many of the organizations which were funding these think tanks, often secretively, but we've found out quite a lot of them, they funded the occupation forces, they funded illegal settlements in the West Bank, and they also funded Zionist organizations in the UK. It does that in order to make sure that it will have enough settlers and steal enough land that there can never be a viable Palestinian state, and that the Palestinians can never present a challenge in terms of the governance of the whole of Palestine. My name is David Miller. I was formerly the Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol. I was sacked in October 2021, and that I've been dismissed with because of my anti-Zionist views, and thus that anti-Zionist views should be protected under law in the UK. Today, I am a journalist and researcher, and I produce a show called Palestine Declassified on Press TV. I set up an organization called Public Interest Investigations in 2005. The reason we set up that organization back then was for two reasons. One was because of the illegal invasion of Iraq and the need to monitor propaganda and lies in the public sphere. But the second reason was because we had been involved in an academic debate about lobbying and lobbying transparency in the UK and in Scotland, and we had argued at the Scottish Parliament for a register of lobbyists, that lobbyists should declare who their clients were and how much money they spent or were paid to lobby government. And we were successful in that, in the sense that the relevant committee argued that there should be such a register. So that's why we set up the organisation, and as part of that organisation, we started to do work on neoconservatism, on Islamophobia, and eventually on the Israel lobby and on Zionism. And it was so I started to attract attention from especially from the Zionists. I remember that starting to happen around about 2011 and 2012, and they started to call me an anti-Semite. And that was really why I became much more interested in Zionism, because I didn't really understand why they would be calling me a lifelong anti-racist and anti-Semite. So I didn't understand what it was that they were saying. And so that made me investigate their activities much more, and I started to investigate Zionism directly. The Zionist movement was created in the late 19th century, and the aim of the movement was to found a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine, of the Mandate of Palestine. And it did that by 1948, and it concluded at its next global meeting in Jerusalem in 1951, that the movement should not be decommissioned, but should be continued. And the reason that it should be continued was they wanted to make sure that they could have a worldwide movement which would continue to support the existence of a Jewish state, of an ethno-supremacist state, and would continue to be able to find ways to do that in a practical way, so sending money, bringing settlers, and all the ways in which the Zionists attempted to foster their state after 1948. So that's the reasons why the Zionist movement does what it does. It does that in order to make sure that it will have enough settlers and steal enough land that there can never be a viable Palestinian state, and that the Palestinians can never present a challenge in terms of the governance of the whole of Palestine. Well, the way I got into studying Islamophobia and then to studying Zionism was the obvious increase in anti-Muslim hatred after the beginning of the war on terror in 2001. And so I did some work on think tanks in the UK who were pushing Islamophobic policies. And one of the ways in which they were doing that was speaking with government to try and make sure that government policies were increasingly punishing Muslims in the UK. And one of the findings was that many of the organizations which were funding these think tanks, often secretively, but we've found out quite a lot of them, and many of these organizations were charitable foundations which had been set up by individuals. And when we looked at what else those charitable foundations funded, we found that they funded the occupation forces, they funded illegal settlements in the West Bank, and they also funded Zionist organizations in the UK. So we realized that what we were dealing with here predominantly was the question of Zionism, and that's what took me on to looking at Zionism and the Israel lobby and their interactions with Islamophobia, but also with policy and with the ongoing genocide in Gaza. It's a mistake to think of the Zionist movement as just the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby, of course, exists. It's a number of organizations which try and influence government policy, foreign policy, domestic policy, policy on extremism and counterterrorism, and all of those kinds of issues. But that is not the full remit of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement does a variety of other things. There's a whole range of organizations in this country which are Zionist, but which are not really part of the lobby. The things that they do is that they raise money to send to engage in ethnic cleansing and land theft in Palestine. They send money to the occupation forces. But also what they do, another important element of their activities, is that they fund other Zionist organizations, sometimes lobby groups in the UK. And the last thing that they do, which I think is perhaps the most important, is that they attempt to radicalize young Jews into the racist ideology of Zionism. And they do that through schools, sometimes even nurseries, through synagogues, through youth groups, and a whole range of organizations, including the so-called birthright trips, which take young Jews, young British Jews to Palestine and inculcate in them the idea that they have a birthright to Palestine, a transparently racist idea, but which is widely supported by a whole range of different Zionist organizations, which are not really reducible to the Israel lobby. There are, of course, Israel lobby groups, and they try and influence government policy, and quite often they are successful. So to give you one example, the British government's current extremism policy was announced in the early part of 2024, and it was effectively taken by the government from the report of an independent reviewer of extremism. But his report was effectively taken from a report issued by a think tank called the Policy Exchange, one of the key Islamophobic think tanks in the country. So an Islamophobic think tank funded by Zionists produces a report which then is adopted by the independent reviewer of extremism, who himself had previously worked for the Policy Exchange. And that's then taken up by the government, and the government minister who introduces this new policy on extremism, directly copied more or less from the think tank, is a minister who was one of the first chairs of that think tank, the Islamophobic Policy Exchange. So that there's a way in which the Zionists are able to effectively inhabit and colonize the policy-making process. So that's one key way in which that works. But the other key way in which it works is that the Zionists have a movement which is worldwide. It's formally organized in 40-odd countries and informally organized in another 60 or so countries. And they have a set of rules for how individual members of the Zionist movement ought to behave in what they call the diaspora, i.e. outside occupied Palestine. And amongst those things, they are required to raise money for the Zionist movement and to encourage Zionism in the society in which they operate. And so that means that when you have Zionists in important positions in culture, in politics, in economics, that what they're required to do by the movement is to pursue the interests of Zionism, as opposed to, and sometimes instead of, the interests of the country in which they live. And so that's the way in which the influence of Zionism is much greater than perhaps the influence of other lobby groups, like, for example, in the US, the Cuban lobby, or indeed even, of course, the so-called Russian lobby or the Chinese lobby, and certainly more important than the Arab or the Palestinian or the Muslim lobby. And that's the way in which the Zionists are able to exert power, not just through what's called the Israel lobby, but through the wider movement and its co-optation or colonization of the wider society. When the US and the UK invaded Iraq in 2003, on a false prospectus, everybody knows that there were no weapons of mass destruction there, and that the lie that there were had been encouraged by especially neoconservative think tanks in the US and in the UK, most of which are, of course, funded by and staffed by card-carrying Zionists. It was perfectly plain in that period that there was an attempt to encourage the idea that Muslims were somehow uncivilized, disloyal, and had a specific affinity for violence, and that therefore Muslims ought to be targeted with propaganda and indeed with negative legal consequences. In the UK, that became the counter-terrorism policy of PREVENT, which was launched first in 2003. And so it was apparent to me that there was increasing anti-Muslim feeling. I started to write about this in 2003, I believe towards the end of 2003, when I was also writing about Iraq. And it was when we got into trying to examine where was the Islamophobia coming from that we alighted upon the think tanks who were pushing Islamophobia. At that time, an organization called the Center for Social Cohesion and the Policy Exchange, two think tanks were active. Later, the Center for Social Cohesion became folded into another new Islamophobic think tank called the Henry Jackson Society. And we became interested in these think tanks, how they operated, who was behind them. And it was only through that, really, that I sort of stumbled upon the role of Zionism, because it was only when we examined the funding sources of these think tanks pushing Islamophobia. We called them, at the time, neoconservative think tanks, and I think that was correct, but we didn't really understand the extent to which behind these think tanks were Zionist funders. Because when we looked at the funding agencies, the foundations which had sent money to these think tanks, we discovered that they were what we later came to know as Zionist family foundations. Well, Islamophobia has a long history in the UK and in other colonial Western colonial powers. But what we see in the contemporary period, the specific forms that Islamophobia has taken, I would say come from a series of interests coalescing. So yes, of course, it's the case that the main organizations in any Western country which push Islamophobia to the extent that Islamophobia is a major issue, which it is in almost every European country, for example, the main bodies which push Islamophobia, what we refer to as the backbone of Islamophobia, is the state counter-terrorism apparatus. That's the border forces, the police, the intelligence agencies, the Ministry of Defence, the military, etc. And they are, of course, the first point of contact for most Muslims with daily harassment. When Muslims come in and out of the country, they're quite often stopped under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. They can be harassed on the street, etc. And that's the main way in which Islamophobia is spread in the country. And that's the backbone, I would say, of Islamophobia. But what we also say is that there are 5 pillars to Islamophobia. The state counter-terrorism apparatus is one of those pillars. But the other pillars, we would say, are social movements which try and push Islamophobia and push a deepening of Islamophobia. And we say that, of course, the far right is one of those pillars. And that's been especially the case since around 2006 in this country. The neoconservative movement is another of those pillars. the Zionist movement, or parts of the Zionist movement, is a fourth of those pillars. And then the final pillar, we say, of Islamophobia is sections of the left, sections of the feminist movement, sections of the secularist movement who are in the end Islamophobic. So that's kind of the range of ways in which Islamophobia is pushed. But the idea of Islamic terrorism, you trace that back. The way in which it emerges into public discussion in the West, in English, is that it's one of the earliest outings of this as a concept of Islamic terrorism as a concept was at a conference of the Jonathan Institute, an Israeli body named after an Israeli military officer who was killed in the Entebbe raid in 1976, called Yonatan Netanyahu, and the think tank was set up, of course, by his brother Benjamin, and they had a conference in Jerusalem in 1980, and then they had one in Washington D.C. in 1984, and that was the 84 conference was the one where the idea of Islamic terrorism became the focus for the first time. And it was launched at that conference by a guy called Bernard Lewis, a well-known Islamophobic and Zionist thinker, and by various of his colleagues. And from there, you start to see the idea of Islamic terrorism percolating through Western security establishments. So it's important, I think, to note that the origination of the concept specifically comes from the Zionists. And the same is the case with the concept of Islamist. The idea that Muslims who are engaged in politics, who use their faith as a guide to their politics, are all more or less, to some extent, the same. They are opposed to democracy, they have reactionary views, they're not civilized. And that, of course, puts all Muslim political action in the same box, and that, of course, is a racist way of doing things. And that term also comes from Zionist intellectuals, with a little bit of help, as I've shown in my research, from the CIA. The CIA was also involved in sponsoring some French intellectuals who are interested in using the term Islamism or Islamist. Islamist is a term which was invented in around about 1979 and hadn't ever existed before. Well, I don't think that the media does promote the idea of Islamophobia. In fact, the idea that there is such a thing as Islamophobia is quite widely dismissed in the mainstream media. But that's because the racists, the Islamophobes, don't like it to be used. They say there's no such thing as Islamophobia, that it's rational to hate Islam, and all those kinds of things. But how does the media promote Islamophobia? Well, there are several ways. I mean, I think that the 5 pillars of Islamophobia, the social movements plus the counter-terrorism apparatus of the state, are the key drivers of the idea that Muslims are a threat in the media. And that's, of course, borne out by every study of official sources in media studies since the beginning of time, that when the media in Western societies come to do a story, the first place they look for authoritative information or for new information is from official sources in the government. When it comes to do with the question of Islam, that is the police, the intelligence services, especially the intelligence services, as a study we did recently showed. And they're the first people that journalists go to, and therefore official ideas dominate the news media. When it comes to the question of Palestine, of course, you have the additional question, not just of official sources. For example, in the UK, British journalists will go to the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence or Downing Street to find out about Palestine, but they will also, if they're doing stories there, they will go to the Israeli government, and they will always regard the Israeli government as being more reliable than the Palestinians, even if they regard the Israeli government as not as reliable as the British government, for example. So there's a kind of hierarchy of sources, which means that from the start you have negative coverage and coverage which is biased against the Palestinians. Now that is part of the explanation, and it's the major part of the explanation, but there's an additional part of the explanation, which is to do with the ownership of media, the editorial policies of media, and indeed the penetration of mainstream media by Zionist ideologues who work as journalists. And of course, some of that is accomplished not just by efficient infiltration by Zionists, but also by the fact that there are many of those who are in charge of or own media platforms who are themselves ideological Zionists. So, for example, Rupert Murdoch is a very good example. Murdoch, of course, is very strongly pro-Israel, and he, of course, makes space in all of his platforms for Zionist journalists. And, of course, that allows Zionists to infiltrate and to masquerade as being journalists, and at the same time to pursue a particular agenda which is never going to be balanced in any kind of way. So you have a number of different factors here influencing the media. I think that the sources are the most important one, but you also have the ideology and the infiltration of Zionists inside the media corporations themselves. So the Zionists have to be racist, okay? They have to be racist in order that they can explain that they attacked and expelled the Palestinians in 1948. They have to say something about the Palestinians not being a real people, not being fully human, and so that means that they have to be anti-Palestinian. It also means, of course, that they have to be anti-Arabs. They have to say that the Arabs are an inferior race in some way. So that leads them to be racist against the Arabs as well. But also, of course, let's remember, most Palestinians are Muslims, and that leads them also to Islamophobia. And that's why they have, in particular, tried to come up with new ideas to show that Muslims are backward in some way or have a particular propensity to violence. And they've tried to spread that all around the world. They've done that in alliance in recent years with who've pushed Islamophobia, and they've done it, of course, through co-opting elements of the far right in the UK and across Europe to create the so-called counter-jihad movement. That's about encouraging Islamophobia, and the Zionists have been behind quite a lot of that. And of course, the Islamophobia network in the US is almost entirely funded by Zionists. So you have a real significant input by Zionism into encouraging anti-Islam feeling. And people don't always understand that. They think that anti-Muslim feeling is just something from the streets. It's to do with the encounter between white people and non-white people, and it always happened. But actually, if you look at it historically, that's not the case. And the reason why we target Muslims now, not black people or the Irish, for example, is because there is an interest in doing so, yes, from the state in the UK, the counter-terrorism apparatus, but also in particular, a funding of increasingly anti-Islam policies and practices by the Zionists through, as I said, the far right, but also through neoconservative or Islamophobic think tanks who focus in particular on trying to influence government policy, with which they've been remarkably successful. The idea of conspiracy theory is an idea which is used by Zionists in order to delegitimize and to block criticism of the activities of the Zionists themselves. So whenever one says something about the Zionist regime or the Zionist entity, which is critical, quite often it will be said that this is a conspiracy theory, and that the implication is that conspiracy theories are in some way either already anti-Semitism or on the way to being anti-Semitism. But I would say, first of all, that the idea that there are conspiracies in society is an idea which is well established. Everyone knows that politics depends on people conspiring together to win in their struggle. Zionists do it, anti-Zionists do it. Everybody does it in politics. But a conspiracy theory is an idea, or at least it should be an idea, which suggests that all that there is in society, it comes about as a result of conspiracies. Now, of course, that's an idea which is plainly wrong. And anyone who has any social science training knows that, of course, that people make history. Yes, of course they do, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, to quote perhaps the most famous socialist sociologist, Karl Marx. So it's perfectly clear that there are circumstances in which people always find themselves in political circumstances where they act, and they act in those circumstances with the resources that they have. It may be the case that the Zionists have a lot of resources and the anti-Zionists don't have very many resources. The idea that there is a new anti-Semitism, which is different to the old anti-Semitism as demonstrated in the Second World War by the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust. And this form of anti-Semitism is especially held by people on the left, by Muslims, by Arabs, and by Palestinians. But of course, the way in which they have defined anti-Semitism is such that whenever you say that the Zionists are creating an ethno-supremacist state, that they're settler colonists, that they're engaged in genocide, all things which are plainly evidenced by the events that we see every day, whenever you say any of these things, these are regarded by them as being anti-Semitism. Now, they spent a long time coming up with this idea of the new anti-Semitism. They've been working on it for more than 50 years. The starting point most people give for the beginning of this is the speech by Abba Eban, the then Zionist foreign minister, which he gave in the US in 1972, where he said for the first time in an open way that anti-Zionism was the new anti-Semitism. And since then, they've tried to find a way to use that notion to discipline and repress anyone who pushes for Palestinian rights. And they did that, first of all, by coming up with what they called a working definition of anti-Semitism, which they managed to sort of lodge with an organization called the European Union Monitoring Centre on Xenophobia, which is a European Union body. And that they managed to do that in 2005 through a series of conferences they had called the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism. But when that body ceased to be and was changed into the current EU body, the Fundamental Rights Agency, they dispensed with that working definition. It was removed from their website, and that led the Zionists to panic. And so consequently, around about 2013-14, at the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, and you can see the minutes of these meetings still online on the internet, they decided they had to find somewhere else to put this working definition. They changed it very slightly, and eventually they found a place to put it, which was the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, who adopted it in 2016, and that was the weapon of choice which the Zionists have used ever since that moment in targeting, for example, Bernie Sanders, presidential candidate in the US, in targeting Jeremy Corbyn, who was elected leader of the Labour Party in the UK in 2015. And it's been a very, very useful weapon. It was, of course, used against me. The University of Bristol adopted it in the middle of complaints against me, and they tried to use it against me. Of course, it failed because I was found not to even to have breached the IHRA, never mind to have been anti-Semitic in any way. But that was the weapon of choice. But in order for that to take effect, they couldn't just have this document on an obscure website. That wasn't just enough. The weapon wasn't enough. It had to be used. And in order for it to be used, they had to have soldiers to use it. And so from around about 2014, the Zionists made sure that they massively increased their investment in the creation of Zionist and Israel lobby groups in the UK and in other countries too, so that, for example, in 2014, 15 and 16, there were something like 40 or 50 new Israel lobby groups created in the UK alone. And it was these organizations which were then able to take the IHRA definition and to use it to batter pro-Palestinian campaigners over the head with it, to say, you're not pro-Palestine, you're a racist against Jews. And that's the heart of their strategy. And it's a strategy which is now beginning to fall apart, as everybody sees day by day the massacres and the genocide in Gaza. The force of the allegation of anti-Semitism is much, much weaker now. People are openly laughing at these allegations on many occasions. That humour and that response to the allegations has not spread to the top of the society. The top of UK society, for example, still takes this seriously. But of course, many, many thousands, if not millions of people now see that it's a strategy, and thus it's becoming a failed strategy. And I would say a failed strategy in the sense that, for example, in the UK, a recent opinion poll shows that young people between, I think, 15 and 20, a majority of them now believe that Israel has no right to exist. Now, that's a sea change in opinions on the existence of the so-called Jewish state. And I believe that that's, is announcing the end of the success of that strategy. Well, it was the question of Islamophobia which led to the first complaints about me, which over the course of 2.5 years led eventually to me being sacked. The complaints about me at the University of Bristol focused on my lecture on Islamophobia, but they then tried to bring in a number of statements I'd made about Zionism over many years, and including many years before I'd even taken up the job at the University of Bristol. Now, that shouldn't ever have been the case. They shouldn't ever have considered such complaints because I hadn't even been at Bristol at the time. But it was my arguments about Islamophobia and its relationship to Zionism and the fact that there was such a thing as the Zionist movement and the Israel lobby, which led to the university coming under huge pressure from Zionists, both inside the university and outside the university through students, and the fact that over 100 members of the Houses of Commons and Lords signed a letter asking for me to be sacked, etc. But then when it came to the court case, I took a court case against the university, a tribunal. I argued that the reason they'd sacked me wasn't because I had made these statements about Islamophobia or because I had criticised Zionist student groups, but the reason that I was sacked was because I was an anti-Zionist and I had anti-Zionist views, and it was those that the university regarded as being so repugnant that they had to sack me. And the university denied this in their formal statements, but when they gave evidence in court, they effectively admitted that that's what had happened. And so the court determined that I had been sacked because I had anti-Zionist views, and that anti-Zionist views were, to use the technical language in the legislation, worthy of respect in a democratic society, and thus not racist, the opposite, in fact, of racist. And so that was the important principle which came out of the case, that anti-Zionist views are now effectively protected in the UK. You can't be sacked for those views. But even more important than that, than the UK effect, is the effect on the argument that the Zionists have used for 50 years, which is that there is no distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We now have a court in the UK declaring there is a distinction, and it's very, very difficult for the Zionists to push back against that, because that's a judgment which they would have to fight in court, and they would probably would lose. This interview is taking place at a time where Zionism is being questioned in the world as never before. Zionism is, as a regime in Palestine, tottering. Its economy is collapsing. It's losing militarily. And we are seeing, I believe, the end of Zionism, the beginning of the end of Zionism. Now, the price of that, of course, is horrific, and the genocide we see every day. But we are beginning to see the dissolution of the settler colony in Palestine. And I think that the sooner that happens, the better. And I would hope that I've played some role in hastening its end.